Tuesdays on Rusthold always smelled like ionized ozone and failing life support systems. It was the day the heavy haulers from the inner rings dumped their industrial excrement into the gravity wells of our sector, and the air scrubbers, ancient and wheezing, could never quite keep up with the stench of progress. I spent most of my mornings in the shadow of the hull plates, waiting for the vibration in my knees to tell me the station's rotation was stabilizing. My name is Vane, and for 32 years, I have been a hull stitcher. I weld the bleeding wounds of starships that have survived the vacuum, sealing their metal skin with plasma and prayers. But lately, the only thing I had been stitching together was my own broken routine. I found her huddled between a stack of rusted radiator coils and a leaking coolant drum outside my workshop. At first, I thought she was just another piece of discarded biosynthetic waste, the kind the synaptic union threw away when the organic components started to degrade. She was curled into a tight ball, trying to occupy as little space as possible in a universe that clearly didn't want her. She was a Voreen. I knew the type. Bioengineered for heavy labor in the asteroid mines, they were taller than humans, their skin a dull, mottled gray that looked like unpolished slate. Her frames were usually thick with muscle, but this girl was different. She was gaunt, the kind of thin that spoke of internal organs starting to cannibalize themselves. Her breathing was a series of shallow, rhythmic clicks, the sound of a biological processor running on its final emergency battery. "Hey," I grunted, kicking a piece of scrap metal nearby to see if she'd bolt. "You can't die here, it's bad for business." She didn't bolt. She didn't even flinch. She just lifted her head, and for a second I forgot about the smell of ozone and the ache in my joints. Her eyes were massive, amber orbs with dual pupils that flickered with a dying golden light. They weren't the vacant, programmed eyes of a labor construct. There was a jagged, raw terror in them that felt uncomfortably human. Voreens in the civilian sectors of Rusthold were usually bad news. They were either runaways or broken units, and the local enforcers had a nasty habit of recycling anyone who harbored them. Most people on this station would have walked past her without a second glance. In a world where air costs credits and water tastes like recycled sweat, pity is a luxury nobody can afford. You acknowledge the suffering of others, and suddenly you're responsible for it. It was much easier to develop a very specific and convenient form of station blindness, but it was the anniversary of the leak, 3 years since the pressure seal in Sector 7G had failed, taking Lyra and our future with it. Grief has a way of making a man do things that defy the cold logic of survival. "Are you hungry?" I asked, my voice sounding like gravel grinding in a gearbox. She stared at me, her mandibles twitching slightly at the edges of her mouth. "Why?" she whispered. The word was hollow, a ghost of a sound. "Does it matter?" I replied. "I'm making protein mash anyway. You can eat it, or you can starve against my wall and make me deal with the cleanup." "Your call." I didn't wait for an answer. I turned and walked into my workshop, leaving the heavy pressure door open. It was a risk. She could have been a lure for a gang of scrap rats, or she could have had a virus patch designed to fry my local network. But I was tired, and a part of me didn't care if the universe finally decided to finish me off. I heard the soft, uneven drag of her footsteps behind me. She kept her distance, her oversized hands twitching as if she expected a plasma bolt to take her in the back. My workshop was a tomb of forgotten machinery, old welding torches, half-finished structural ribs, and crates of thermal shields filled the corners. It was a mess, a reflection of a man who had stopped caring about the order of things the moment the light left his wife's eyes. "Sit," I said, pointing to a crate near the stove. She didn't sit. Voreens were taught that sitting was for masters. They stood until their joints fused or their hearts stopped. She just leaned against a bulkhead, her eyes scanning the room with the frantic intensity of a trapped animal. I started the stove, throwing a handful of dried nutrients and some synthetic pork into a pot. Lyra used to add spices, real ones from the agrarian domes on Velonis Prime. She used to say that even in a scrap heap, life should have flavor. I just made it taste like fuel. When I placed the bowl in front of her, she didn't touch it. She looked at the steam rising from the mash as if it were a poisonous gas. "It isn't spiked," I said, taking a spoonful myself. "See? Still breathing." She ate then, not with the desperation I expected, but with a slow, agonizing control. It was the way someone eats when they know their body might reject the sudden influx of energy. When she finished, she looked at the empty bowl, then at me. "I have no credits," she said. Her voice was becoming clearer, less robotic. "I have no data slugs to trade." "I didn't ask for any," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "You have a name sample?" "Kalia," she said. "Vane," I muttered. "You got a place to recharge?" "No. You got anyone looking for you?" She shivered then, a violent tremor that rattled her slate-gray skin. "Everyone," she whispered. I looked at the empty chair across from me. It had been Lyra's favorite spot. Nobody had touched it in 3 years. I looked at the workshop, covered in a layer of dust so thick it felt like felt. "My workshop is a disaster," I said, gestured to the piles of scrap. "If you can handle a broom and a sonic scrubber, you can stay in the back room. There's a cot and the air seals are solid. I'll give you 3 meals a day and won't turn you over to the enforcers." Kalia looked at me like I'd just offered her the captaincy of a dreadnought. "That is all? You do not want access?" I knew what she meant. Synaptic union models were often modified for things that had nothing to do with labor. I felt a surge of old-fashioned human disgust. "I want my floor swept and my hex bolts sorted by size, Kalia. Nothing else. You work, you eat, you sleep. You don't work, you're back in the scrap pile. Simple enough?" She nodded, a slow, solemn movement. That was the beginning. A transaction born of dust and protein mash. We didn't know then that some debts aren't paid in credits. Some debts are etched into the very core of your being. And when they come due, they change the gravity of your entire world. The next morning, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in 1,000 days. It wasn't the groan of the station's superstructure or the hiss of the steam pipes. It was the sound of rhythmic scrubbing. I rolled out of my bunk, my back popping like a series of small explosions, and made my way to the kitchen area. The smell of ionized dust was gone, replaced by something faint and clean. The scent of filtered water and industrial soap. Kalia was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the floor plates with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. She had already cleared the mountain of empty ration packs and sorted the tangled mess of power cables that usually tripped me up on my way to the coffee machine. The table, the one I hadn't wiped down since Lyra's funeral, was gleaming under the flickering overhead lights. "You're up early," I said, squinting against the unusual cleanliness. "I did not know the shift cycle of this sector," Kalia said, standing up. Her height was imposing when she wasn't hunched over. She nearly brushed the ceiling pipes. So I began when the internal lights hit 10% luminosity. She had also made breakfast. It wasn't the protein mash I usually choke down. She had found a jar of old algae paste and some dehydrated tubers in the back of the pantry, and somehow turned them into a savory porridge. It had a sharp, spicy kick to it. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" I asked, taking a cautious bite. "In the union creches, they taught us to maximize the flavor of low-grade rations to keep morale from bottoming out," she explained. "It was the efficiency protocol." "Efficiency," I muttered. "Trust a corporation to turn a meal into a math problem." But it was good. Better than good. It made me feel like a person again, rather than just another machine waiting for its parts to fail. After breakfast, I led her into the workshop. If the kitchen had been a mess, the workshop was a crime scene of industrial neglect. I pointed to a corner where a heavy hand-carved wooden broom stood against the wall. It was a relic, a piece of actual timber in a world made of alloy. The handle was etched with small, delicate flowers. "This was my wife's," I said, my voice tightening. "She used to say that even a hull welder's shop should be treated with respect. She spent hours carving those designs." Kalia reached out, her long gray fingers hovering over the wood before she dared to touch it. "It is biological. It's wood, Kalia, from a tree, probably from Earth, a long time ago. It's yours now. Use it well." She took the broom as if I were handing her a sacred relic. Her eyes tracked the lines of the flowers, her amber pupils dilating. "I will protect its integrity, Vane." "I know you will," I said, and for some reason, I believed her. I spent the next few hours at my workbench, trying to realign the magnetic coils on a damaged thruster nozzle, but my eyes kept drifting to her. Kalia moved through the chaos of the shop like a ghost through a graveyard. She didn't just move things. She organized them with a cold, terrifying logic. Screws were sorted by thread pitch. Welding rods were categorized by alloy density. She found tools I hadn't seen in 2 years, buried under piles of oxidized slag. Around midday, a shadow fell across the workshop door. It was my neighbor, Silas. Silas was a scrap trader who survived by being more paranoid than everyone else on the station combined. He took one look at Kalia, and his hand went straight to the neural dampener hanging from his belt. "Vane," he said, his voice low and vibrating with suspicion. "You got a Voreen in your shop." "Her name's Kalia," I said, not looking up from my torch. Silas stepped inside, his eyes darting around the newly cleaned space. "She's Union property, Vane. You know the laws. Harboring a runaway is a fast track to the airlock. And look at her. She's gaunt, defective. If she's got a glitch in her logic gates, she could snap and tear your head off before you can trigger a distress signal." "She's a cleaner, Silas," I replied, finally turning off the plasma flame. "And she's doing a better job of it than I ever did. If you want to talk about laws, let's talk about the stolen capacitors you've been selling to the Black Sun Syndicate." Silas's face went pale. Well, as pale as a man who lived under artificial lights could get. "That's different. That's business. This is dangerous. They're not like us, Vane. They're built, not born. They don't have souls. They have subroutines." Kalia had stopped working. She was standing perfectly still, the wooden broom clutched in her hands. Her head was bowed, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She was waiting for the blow to fall, for the rejection she had been programmed to expect. I stood up and walked over to Silas, my heavy boots clanging on the deck plates. "I'm an old man, Silas. I've spent 47 years on this station. I've seen humans do things that would make a biosynth scream, and I've seen machines show more loyalty than any credit-hungry trader. Kalia stays. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with my welding torch." Silas spat on the floor, a waste of moisture that showed just how angry he was. "It's your funeral, Stitcher. When the Union comes looking for their property, don't expect the rest of us to burn for your stupidity." He turned and stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the racks of hex bolts. The silence that followed was heavy. I looked at Kalia. She was still holding the broom, her knuckles a lighter shade of gray. "You should not have done that," she said softly. "He is correct. I am a liability. My presence increases the probability of your termination by 85%. I don't care about probabilities, Kalia. I care about the fact that my workshop looks like a workshop again. I care about the fact that the protein mash didn't taste like cardboard this morning." "Why?" she asked, looking at me with those amber eyes. "Why do you protect me?" I looked at the broom in her hand, at the flowers Lyra had carved with such love and patience. "Because," I said, leaning against the workbench, 3 years ago, this house became a tomb. I walked past that empty chair in the kitchen, and I felt like I was already dead, just waiting for the station to run out of air. I paused, rubbing the ache in my chest. "You being here? It's the first thing that's felt like real life since the leak. You're not a subroutine, Kalia. You're a person who's been treated like scrap. And in this shop, we don't throw away things that still have a use." Kalia didn't say anything for a long time. Then she reached out and touched her own chest, right over where her biological heart pump was located. "In my sector," she whispered, "we had a word for this. Zenthan. It means a shared breath. When two people breathe the same air and choose to keep each other alive. I'm not much for poetry," I said, turning back to my work. "But shared breath sounds better than shared scrap." We worked through the rest of the day in a new kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of two strangers, but the quiet understanding of two survivors. I taught her how to prime a plasma torch, and she taught me how to adjust the nutritional balance of the station's recycled water. But as the night cycle began, and the station's lights dimmed to a deep, bruised purple, I couldn't shake the feeling that Silas was right about one thing. The Synaptic Union didn't like losing property, and they had very long memories. I lay in my bunk that night, listening to the quiet movements of Kaylee in the back room. For the first time in 3 years, the house felt full, but beneath the comfort, there was a cold, sharp dread. I knew the Union would come, and when they did, I would have to decide if a shared breath was worth a final stand. The atmosphere inside the workshop had thickened over the last 4 days, but not with the usual greasy fog of burnt flux or the metallic tang of shaved alloy. It was something else, a quiet, pulsating tension that seemed to emanate directly from Kalia. She was efficient, yes, but there was a strange, erratic quality to her movements whenever I got too close. It happened on a Friday during the peak of the station's gravitational shift. The giant gas planet Ouroboros was tugging at Rusthold's stabilizers, causing the deck plates to groan and the lighting to flicker into a sickly, rhythmic dimming. I was struggling with a pressurized hydraulic manifold from a heavy-class freighter. The metal was stubborn, warped by heat stress, and my old hands were slick with lubricating oil. "Watch it," I muttered to myself as the wrench slipped. I didn't catch the warning in time. The manifold hissed. A sudden jet of superheated hydraulic fluid sprang out from a hairline fracture. It caught my left forearm, searing through my work sleeve and cooking the skin beneath. I didn't scream. I'd been a stitcher too long for that. But I grunted, a sharp, ragged sound of agony that echoed through the hollow workshop. I dropped the manifold and it clattered against the floor like a gunshot. Then I heard it, a cry that wasn't mine. I turned, clutching my burning arm, and saw Kalia. She was 10 meters away near the sorting bins, but she had collapsed to her knees as if she had been the one hit by the spray. Her gray hands were clamped over her own left forearm, exactly where my burn was. Her amber eyes were wide, the dual pupils spinning in a frantic golden blur. She was gasping, her chest heaving in short, violent bursts. "Kalia," I managed, the pain in my arm making my vision swim. "What happened? Did a pipe burst over there?" She didn't answer. She was rocking back and forth, making a low, keening sound that vibrated in my teeth. I ignored the fire in my arm and stumbled toward her. When I reached her, I reached out to grab her shoulder, but she flinched so hard she struck the bulkhead. "Don't!" she shrieked. It's too hot. It burns, Vane. Please, make the burning stop." I froze. I looked down at her arm. Her skin was intact. There was no fluid, no steam, no red welt rising on her slate-gray flesh. Then I looked back at my own arm, where the skin was already blistering into an ugly blackened mess. You felt that?" I whispered. The gold light in her eyes began to settle, the pupils slowing their frantic dance. She looked at my arm, then at her own, her breathing finally evening out into a ragged hiss. The phantom pain seemed to be receding, leaving her trembling and weak. "I am sorry, Vane," she whispered, her voice barely more than a click of mandibles. "I did not mean to interrupt the workflow." "Forget the workflow, Kalia. How did you do that? You're a Voreen. You're built to ignore pain, not harvest it from someone else. You're supposed to be an organic tractor, not an echo chamber." She looked away, her gaze fixing on a pile of discarded copper wiring. She seemed to shrink, as if trying to fold herself back into the shadows of the scrap heap where I'd found her. "I am a defective unit," she said. Her voice had lost its robotic edge, replaced by a hollow, haunting vulnerability. During my incubation in the Union labs, they were experimenting with a new series of biological processors. They called it the empathy core. The goal was to create units that could coordinate perfectly in high-risk environments by sensing the physical and emotional states of their squad mates. A collective consciousness for the labor force. I leaned against a crate, my burnt arm throbbing in time with the station's heartbeat. An empathy core. You're telling me those corporate ghouls tried to mass-produce a soul? They did not call it that, Kalia replied. They called it a tactical resonance interface. But the experiment failed. The test subjects couldn't handle the sensory overload. When one worker was injured, the entire line collapsed in sympathetic agony. It was inefficient. The union ordered the project terminated. All units were scheduled for recycling. "But you got out," I said. She nodded slowly. "A technician?" He was not like the others. He saw me reacting to a bird that had flown into the cooling fans outside the lab. I was crying, though I did not know what tears were then. He told me that a heart that feels for a bird shouldn't be turned into biosludge. He scrambled my ID signature and pushed me into a waste shuttle heading for the outer rings. I have been ghosting through the scrap lanes ever since, trying to keep the noise out. The noise? The pain of others, Vane. On a station like Rusthold, the air is thick with it. Hunger, anger, grief. It's like a constant static in the back of my brain. I have to stay away from the crowded sectors. If I get too close to the slums, the static becomes a scream. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and felt a cold weight settle in my gut. This girl wasn't just a runaway laborer. She was a walking, breathing wound. She had no armor against a universe that was nothing but sharp edges. "Is that why you're so quiet?" I asked. "Why you move like you're walking on broken glass?" "Yes," she whispered, "and why I was dying when you found me. The hunger was bad, but the loneliness was worse. Loneliness has a very specific frequency, Vane. It feels like cold iron pressing against your ribs." I had given up on trying to filter it out. I stayed silent for a long minute. The pain in my arm was dulling now, the adrenaline fading. I should have been terrified. Silas was right. She was a liability beyond anything I had imagined. If the Union found out a surviving empathy unit was sitting in a two-room workshop on Rusthold, they wouldn't just send enforcers. They'd send a goddamn tactical retrieval squad and level the entire sector to get their property back. But as I watched her sit there, small and trembling, despite her imposing height, all I could think about was the bird that had flown into the fans, and the girl who had cried for it. "Come here," I said, my voice softer than it had been in years. She hesitated, then crawled toward me. I reached into the first aid kit on my belt and pulled out a tube of biosynthetic gel. "Apply this to my arm," I told her. "Why?" she asked. "You can do it yourself." "I want you to see that it's not all pain, Kalia. The gel cools the burn, it stops the fire. If you're going to feel what I feel, then I want you to feel the healing too." She took the tube with fingers that shook. She squeezed a dollop of the clear blue gel onto her palm, and then, with a delicacy that felt like a prayer, she spread it over my scorched skin. As the chemicals reacted with the burn, the agony vanished, replaced by a deep, numbing chill. I watched her face. Her amber eyes closed, and a small, shaky sigh escaped her mandibles. Her body relaxed, the tension draining out of her as the phantom fire in her own arm went out. For a moment, we were linked by something that wasn't scrap or credits or corporate mandates. We were two broken things finding a moment of silence in the storm. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't mention it," I said, pulling my sleeve back down. "Now let's get this floor finished. If we're going to be a shared breath, we might as well do it in a clean shop." But as I went back to the manifold, my mind was racing. I had made a choice, but it wasn't just about a room and a meal anymore. I had chosen to harbor a soul in a world that only recognized assets. It was a dangerous game, the kind where the house always wins and the players end up as space dust. I looked at the wrench in my hand and wondered how much more static we could take before we both short-circuited. The following Tuesday, the station's life support went into a low-power cycle, which meant the air was thinner and the gravity felt 10% heavier than usual. I was out at the main docking hub, trying to haggle for a new set of thermal couplers, leaving Kalia alone to finish the inventory of the back storage room. The back room was a dark, cramped space filled with crates I hadn't opened since we moved from the inner sectors. It was where the remnants of a different life were stored, the things that were too painful to look at, but too precious to vent into the void. When I returned 3 hours later, the workshop was silent. No scrubbing, no clatter of metal. My heart skipped a beat, a sudden sharp fear that the Union had found her while I was gone. "Kalia!" I shouted, dropping the couplers on the floor. A soft light flickered from the back room. I hurried toward it, my hand already reaching for the heavy iron pry bar I kept by the door. But when I stepped inside, I didn't find enforcers. I found Kalia sitting on the floor, surrounded by open crates. In her lap was a shimmering, silk-woven shawl, a deep, iridescent blue that caught the dim light like the surface of a distant ocean. It had been Lyra's. Beside her was an old data pendant, its crystal surface scratched but still glowing with a faint, pulsing amber. "I told you to inventory the spare parts," I said, my voice coming out harsher than I intended. "Not to go through my personal effects." Kalia didn't look up immediately. Her hand was draped over the shawl, her fingers tracing the delicate weave. She looked as though she were in a trance, her amber eyes unfocused. It's, it's so loud in here, Vane, she whispered. Loud? It's a storage closet. It's the quietest place on the station. No, she said, finally looking at me. Not the sound, the echo. This fabric, these objects, they are saturated with a frequency I have never felt before. It isn't pain, it isn't hunger. It feels like a warmth that has no sun, a resonance that keeps repeating over and over, like a heartbeat that refuses to stop even when the heart is gone. I felt a lump form in my throat, thick as a weld bead. You're feeling Lyra, I muttered, leaning against the doorframe. She wore that shawl the night we arrived on Rusthold. She said it was the only beautiful thing left in a world of iron. Kalia picked up the data pendant. When her skin touched the crystal, the amber light flared, and a holographic image projected into the cramped space. It was a flickering, low-resolution recording of Lyra. She was laughing, her dark hair wind-swept from the station's ventilation fans, her eyes bright with a stubborn, defiant joy. Vane, look, the recording of Lyra said, her voice tinny and distorted by years of data decay. I found a real flower in the hydroponics bay, a dandelion. They were going to recycle it as biomatter. Can you believe that? I told them it was a citizen, not a fuel source. The image flickered and vanished, leaving the room darker than before. Kalia was trembling now, but not with fear. There was a look of profound wonder on her face. She saw the dandelion as a person, Kalia said, just like you saw me. I sat down on a crate, the weight of the years suddenly feeling like 100 atmospheres of pressure. Lyra was a dreamer, Kalia. She believed that everything had a spark, even the rusted hull of the station. She spent her whole life trying to save things that were already broken, including me. She loved you, Kalia said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. I can feel the resonance of it in everything she touched. It's like a hum in the metal. It's beautiful, Vane, but it's also very heavy. I know, I said, staring at the empty air where the hologram had been. Sometimes it feels like I'm carrying the weight of the whole station on my chest. Kalia reached out and took my hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact. Her gray skin was cool, but the sensation that flooded through me wasn't physical. Through her empathy core, I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. It was as if she were taking a portion of that heavy, suffocating grief and distributing it across her own vast, artificial nervous system. The pressure in my chest eased. For the first time in 3 years, I could take a deep breath without it hurting. She is not gone, Vane, Kalia whispered. Not as long as the frequency remains. You are her dandelion. We sat there for a long time in the dark, surrounded by the ghosts of a better time. But the universe has a nasty way of reminding you that peace is a temporary glitch in the system. A sudden, sharp vibration rattled the workshop. It wasn't the usual groan of the station. It was a heavy rhythmic thrumming, the sound of a high-yield ion engine docking in the private berths of the upper ring. Those kinds of engines didn't belong to scrap traders or freighter captains. They belonged to the Union. My internal comms unit chirped, a high-pitched, urgent frequency that only sector stitchers used. I tapped the receiver behind my ear. Vane? It was Silas. His voice was frantic, stripped of its usual bravado. You need to bug out, man. Right now. What's going on, Silas? I asked, my blood turning to liquid nitrogen. A Union retrieval ship just docked in berth 42. They didn't even wait for the pressure seal to clear. They've got a hunter with them, a big one. Gray skin, mechanical eyes carrying a pulse cannon like it's a toy. They're showing your workshop's coordinates to the enforcers. Silas, why are you telling me this? I thought you wanted us recycled. He hesitated, the sound of static hissing in the background. I saw the girl, Vane. I saw her scrubbing your floor. I thought she was just a glitchy machine. But then I saw how you looked at her, like she was a person. And I remember how you looked when Lyra was alive. I don't like runaways, but I don't like seeing a man get flatlined for being decent. Now get moving. The hunter is already on the move. The comms went dead. I looked at Kalia. She had heard it all. Her pupils were spinning again, the golden light flickering with terror. They are here, she whispered. The static. It's changing. It's cold now, like a vacuum. I stood up, my joints screaming, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I grabbed the silk shawl and the data pendant and shoved them into a pack. Then I reached for the iron pry bar and my heavy-duty welding torch. We're not going to be anyone's scrap pile today, Kalia. But as we stepped out into the main workshop, the front door hissed open. A figure stood in the entrance, framed by the harsh, blue glare of the station's emergency lights. He was a Voreen, but he was nothing like Kalia. He was massive, his muscles reinforced with shimmering carbon fiber weaves. His left eye had been replaced by a rotating optical sensor that clicked as it scanned the room. On his back was a heavy pulse cannon, its power cell humming with a low, deadly vibration. His skin was a pale, unnatural white, the color of a dead star. Subject 749, the hunter said. His voice was a flat, synthesized monotone that carried no emotion, no resonance. You have been identified as unauthorized Union property. Your current biological status is designated as surplus. He stepped into the shop, his heavy boots cracking the floor plates. I moved in front of Kalia, the pry bar held tight in my hands. It was a pathetic defense against a hunter, but I wasn't moving. She's not a subject, I spat. Her name is Kalia, and this shop is private property. You're void-walking, hunter. Get out before I report a trespass to the enforcers. The hunter's mechanical eye whirred, focusing on me. I am Mordak, he said. I do not recognize local jurisdiction. The Stitcher human is interfering with a priority retrieval. Probability of human survival if resistance continues. 0%. Vane, please, Kalia whispered from behind me. She was trembling so hard I could hear her bones rattling. He is a voidwalker. He has no frequency. He is empty. I didn't care about his frequency. I cared about the fact that he was standing in Lyra's shop, threatening someone I had chosen to protect. I've had a bad Tuesday, Mordak, I said, thumbing the ignition on my welding torch. The plasma flame roared to life, a brilliant, angry blue. And I'm not in the mood for a corporate audit. The hunter didn't flinch. He reached for the cannon on his back. In that moment, the air in the workshop felt like it was being sucked out into the void. This was it, the point where the choices we make finally demand their payment in blood. But as Mordak raised his weapon, Kalia did something I didn't expect. She didn't run. She stepped out from behind me and raised her hands, her amber eyes glowing with a sudden, blinding intensity. You are not empty, Mordak, she cried. I can feel the scream you've been hiding for 20 years. The hunter froze. His mechanical eye spun erratically, and for a split second, the cold, flat mask of his face cracked. A flicker of something, agony, memory, humanity, flashed across his pale features. The power cell on his cannon surged, then sputtered. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed Kalia's hand and pulled her toward the back ventilation shaft. Move! I roared. We disappeared into the dark, narrow tunnels of the station's guts, leaving the workshop and our old lives behind. The chase had begun, and Rusthold was no longer a home. It was a hunting ground. But as we scrambled through the darkness, I felt Kalia's hand in mine. It was cold and she was terrified. But through the empathy core, I felt something new. It wasn't just grief or fear. It was a spark of something fierce and unyielding. It was hope. And in the vacuum of space, that was the most dangerous weapon of all. The ventilation shafts of Rusthold were the station's intestines, a labyrinth of narrow, grease-slicked pipes and humming turbines that smelled of stale, recycled air and the metallic rot of centuries. We had been crawling for nearly 2 hours, my knees screaming with every meter and my burnt arm throbbing in rhythm with the station's distant industrial heart. I was 54 years old and my body was reminding me with every agonizing inch that I was built for welding benches, not commando-style extractions. Stay low, I whispered, though the roar of the massive cooling fans a few levels down made stealth almost redundant. We're coming up on Subdeck 9, the gutter. Kalia was behind me, her long frame cramped in the tight space. I could feel her through the air, not just the sound of her breathing, but the static she'd mentioned. It was vibrating against my spine, a cold, prickly sensation that told me she was terrified. Her empathy core was wide open, soaking up the ambient misery of the station like a sponge. Vane, she rasped, her voice catching on a sob. It is too much. The people below. They are so hungry. It feels like 1,000 tiny needles pressing into my skin. Close your eyes, I told her, pausing to wipe the sweat from my brow. Focus on the resonance. Remember Lyra's shawl? Focus on the warmth. I reached back and squeezed her hand. For a second, the prickly static smoothed out into a dull hum. She took a shuddering breath and nodded. We kept moving until the shaft opened into a wide, dark cavern filled with a forest of dangling power cables and the flickering blue glow of neon signs. Subdeck 9 wasn't officially part of the station's registry. It was a sprawling slum built into the gaps between the massive structural ribs of the outer ring. Here, the law didn't bother with badges. It was enforced by the weight of your credits or the sharpness of your blade. They called it the gutter because everything the upper decks didn't want, trash, sewage, and broken people, eventually filtered down here. We dropped out of the vent and landed on a rusted catwalk. Below us, the streets were narrow alleyways packed with makeshift shacks made of corrugated alloy and plastic sheeting. The air was thick with the smell of cheap synthetic spirits and the spicy, acrid scent of street food. This way, I said, keeping my hand on the pry bar tucked into my belt. We need to find Jax. Who is Jax? Kalia asked, her amber eyes scanning the shadows with frantic intensity. An old friend, I replied, though friend was a generous word in the gutter. She runs a black market med bay and a chop shop. She owes me for a hull breach I patched 10 years ago without asking for a single mark. We navigated the crowded walkways trying to disappear into the mass of desperate humanity. People here didn't care about a tired old stitcher, but a Voreen was a different story. I saw the looks, the narrow, suspicious eyes tracking Kalia's height and her gray skin. To them, she wasn't a person. She was a bag of valuable biosynthetic parts that could keep a family fed for a year. Easy, I muttered, catching a man reaching for a concealed shiv as we passed. He looked at my welding torch and thought better of it. We're just ghosting through, kid. No trouble. The man spat on the deck and vanished into the crowd. We're in trouble, Vane, Kalia whispered. They look at me like I am a harvest. That's because they don't know any better, I said, though the bitterness in my own voice surprised me. Poverty makes people small, Kalia. It shrinks their world until they can only see what they can take. We reached a door marked with a fading red cross and a jagged lightning bolt. I hammered on the metal, 3 long beats, 2 short ones. A small slit opened, and a pair of cybernetic eyes, one blue and one a glowing neon pink, peered out. Vane? The voice was like sandpaper on glass. You're dead. Everyone says you got flatlined in Sector 7. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Jax, I said. Now open the damn door before the hunter catches the scent. The door hissed open, and we stepped into a room that smelled of antiseptic and ozone. Jax was a short, wiry woman with arms that were more chrome than flesh. She was wearing a grease-stained lab coat and had a magnifying lens flipped up over her head. She took one look at Kalia and whistled. You've got a lot of nerve, Stitcher. That's a 7 Series Voreen. The Union is offering 50,000 marks for her return. No questions asked. Do you have any idea how much airtime 50,000 marks buys in this dump? I know, I said, stepping between Jax and Kalia. But she's not property. She's a friend. Jax laughed, a dry, hacking sound. A friend? Since when did you start making friends with laboratory equipment? You've been sniffing too much plasma gas, Vane. She felt my burn, Jax, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. She felt it before I even knew I was hit. She's got an empathy core. A real one. Jax's cybernetic eyes whirred as they focused. The pink one began to glow brighter. An empathy core? Those were myths, corporate bedtime stories to scare the techs. It's real, Kalia said, her voice steady despite the fear. And right now, I can feel your greed, Jax. It feels like a sharp, cold hook in the center of your chest. It is not a pleasant frequency. Jax flinched, her hand twitching toward a concealed stun baton on her workbench. She looked from Kalia to me, her mechanical eye clicking rapidly. Sit down, she muttered, gesturing to a surgical chair that had seen better centuries. Let me see your arm, Vane. And the girl. She needs a nutrient infusion if she's going to keep moving. She looks like she's running on fumes and stubbornness. As Jax worked on my arm, applying a fresh layer of medical-grade sealant, Kalia sat on a crate in the corner. She looked exhausted, her gray skin taking on a yellowish tint. The infusion Jax hooked up to her arm seemed to help, the golden light in her eyes stabilizing. "Listen to me, Vane," Jax said, her voice unusually quiet. "You can't stay here. Mordak, that hunter you mentioned, he's already in the gutter. He doesn't care about the enforcers, and he doesn't care about collateral damage. He's been cracking heads from here to the cooling arrays." "Why is he so obsessed with her?" I asked. "The Union has thousands of Voreens." "Not with her core," Jax replied. "Think about it. A biological unit that can feel what its master feels, that can predict an opponent's move by sensing their intent. That's not a laborer, Vane. That's the ultimate weapon. If they can stabilize that tech, they can create an army that moves like a single organism. No lag, no hesitation." Kalia shuddered. "They want to turn a heart into a trigger." "Exactly," Jax said. "And Mordak, he's the prototype for the other side of the coin. Total sensory suppression. He's the void that's supposed to contain the fire. But if he's glitching, if he's remembering who he was before they hollowed him out, then he's a liability to them too. That's why he's so desperate. He needs to bring you back to prove he's still a loyal tool." The turning point came 10 minutes later. A sudden, violent tremor shook the building. The sound of a pulse cannon discharge echoed through the walls, followed by the screams of people in the street. "He's here," Kalia whispered, her hands flying to her head. The scream, it's so loud. Everyone is terrified. It's like being drowned in acid. Jax cursed and started throwing data pads into a bag. "There's a back exit through the waste reclamation tunnels. It'll take you to the transport hub in Sector 12. If you can reach the long-haul freighters, you might be able to find a pilot willing to take you to the independent colonies." "Jax, why are you helping us?" I asked, surprised by her sudden urgency. "Because," Jax said, looking at Kalia with a strange, fleeting expression of regret, "I used to be a technician for the Union before I lost these arms to one of their safety protocols. I've spent 20 years trying to forget the faces of the units I helped build. If you can get her out, maybe I can sleep for an hour without seeing gray skin in my dreams." "Now move!" We scrambled out the back door just as the front of the med bay exploded inward in a shower of sparks and metal. I didn't look back. I grabbed Kalia's hand and ran into the darkness of the reclamation tunnels, the smell of ozone and death hot on our heels. We were no longer just running for our lives. We were running to keep a soul from being turned into a weapon. And in the gutter of Rusthold, that was a tall order for a tired old man and a girl who felt too much. The reclamation tunnels were a nightmare of sludge and steam, a place where the station's waste was processed by massive, slow-moving grinders. The noise was deafening, a constant grinding roar that made communication impossible. We were wading through knee-deep gray water, the bioluminescent moss on the walls providing the only light. Kalia was struggling. The nutrient infusion Jax had given her was helping, but the psychic weight of the station was taking a physical toll. She was pale, her movements sluggish, and her eyes were constantly darting to the shadows. "Vane!" she shouted over the roar of a nearby turbine. "He is close. I can feel the cold. It's like a hole in the universe moving toward us." "How far?" I yelled back, my lungs burning from the humid, tainted air. 200 meters, maybe less. He is not running. He is tracking. He knows exactly where we are because he can feel my fear. It's a beacon to him. I stopped and looked around. We were in a wide junction where 4 tunnels met. Above us, a massive cooling array hummed with lethal levels of electricity. The catwalks were slick with condensation, and the drops of water falling from the ceiling felt like ice against my neck. Then the cold reached us. The noise of the machinery didn't change, but the atmosphere did. The air grew brittle, the humidity freezing into a fine mist. From the tunnel we had just exited, a figure emerged. Mordak. He moved with a terrifying mechanical grace, his white skin gleaming like bone in the mossy light. His optical sensor whirred, its red light cutting through the mist like a laser. He didn't have his pulse cannon drawn. He didn't need it. His hands were already half transformed into jagged carbon fiber blades. "Subject 749, Mordak said. His voice was no longer a flat monotone. There was a jagged, desperate edge to it, like metal scraping on metal. "You are causing significant structural damage to the sector. Your evasion is illogical. Your termination is inevitable." "Mordak, stop," Kalia cried, stepping forward despite my attempt to hold her back. "I know you can feel me. I can feel the part of you that's screaming. The part they tried to delete." The hunter froze. His mechanical eye spun in a frantic circle, and a series of high-pitched clicks erupted from the processor in his neck. For a moment, the red light dimmed, replaced by a flickering amber that matched Kalia's eyes. "Silence," Mordak roared, the sound echoing through the junction. "I am a Voidwalker. I feel nothing. I am the mandate of the Union." "Liar!" Kalia stepped closer, her own eyes glowing with a blinding golden light. "You remember the creches. You remember the unit you called brother? The one they recycled because he wouldn't stop singing. I can feel the song, Mordak. It's still there, buried under the ice." Mordak let out a sound that was half scream, half static. He lunged forward, his blades whistling through the air. I swung the pry bar with everything I had, catching his arm and deflecting the strike into a structural pillar. Sparks showered over us as the metal groaned. "Get back, Kalia," I yelled, swinging again. I was no match for a Voidwalker. Mordak backhanded me with enough force to send me flying across the catwalk. I hit the railing hard, the wind knocked out of me, the world spinning in a blur of gray and gold. I tasted copper in my mouth and felt the warm trickle of blood from my forehead. Mordak turned his attention back to Kalia. He grabbed her by the throat, lifting her off the ground with one hand. His blades retracted, replaced by a crushing grip that threatened to snap her neck. "You are a defect," Mordak hissed. "You are a mirror that reflects things that should not exist. The Union was right to discard you. I will end the resonance." Kalia didn't fight him. She didn't claw at his hand or try to kick free. Instead, she reached up and placed her hands on either side of his pale, scarred face. "Then feel it," she whispered, her voice clear even over the roar of the grinders. "Feel the weight of what you've done. Feel the people you've flatlined. Feel the brothers you've lost. Feel the soul you're trying to kill." The empathy core flared. A wave of golden light erupted from Kalia, washing over Mordak like a solar flare. I felt it even from 10 meters away. A sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion that hit me like a physical blow. It was a tidal wave of grief, of love, of regret, and of a loneliness so profound it felt like the heat death of the universe. Mordak's mechanical eye shattered. A spray of black fluid leaked from the socket as he let out a sound that wasn't human or machine. It was a howl of pure, unadulterated agony. He dropped Kalia and stumbled back, his hands clawing at his head as if trying to rip the memories out of his brain. Kalia collapsed to the catwalk, her light fading, her body limp. "Mordak," I gasped, struggling to my feet. The hunter looked at me. His one remaining eye was no longer red. It was a dull, pained brown. The white skin on his face was twitching, the muscles underneath spasming in a chaotic rhythm. He looked at Kalia, then at his own hands, his expression one of horrified realization. "The song," he whispered, the synthesized voice box glitching. I remember the song." He looked up at the cooling array above us, then back at the tunnel entrance where the sound of enforcer boots was getting louder. They were coming for all of us now. "Run," Mordak said, the word barely a breath. "What?" I asked. "The Union, they are tracking the pulse signature of her core. They will be here in 3 minutes. You must go to Sector 12. Berth 99, a ship called the Star Seeker. Tell the captain, tell her the void has ended. Mordak, come with us." Kalia managed, reaching out a weak hand. "I cannot," Mordak said, his voice regaining some of its strength. "I am a Voidwalker. I am built of their crimes. I will hold the line here. It is the only honor I have left." He turned toward the tunnel entrance and drew his pulse cannon. His movements were still mechanical, but there was a new purpose in them, a defiance that hadn't been there before. "Go!" he roared. I grabbed Kalia, slinging her arm over my shoulder, and began to run. We scrambled through the junction and into the next tunnel, the sound of energy fire erupting behind us. I heard Mordak scream again, but this time it wasn't a howl of pain. It was a battle cry. We reached the transport hub 20 minutes later. Sector 12 was a chaotic mess of cargo containers and frantic travelers. But we found Berth 99. The Star Seeker was an old, battered freighter that looked like it was held together by spit and prayers. Exactly my kind of ship. The captain, a tall woman with skin the color of polished mahogany and a sharp, intelligent gaze, was waiting at the ramp. "Vane?" she asked, her hand on her holster. "Mordak sent us," I panted, lowering Kalia to the deck. "He said the void has ended." The captain's expression softened, a look of profound sadness crossing her face. "Then Mordak has found his peace," she whispered. "Get on board. We're burning fuel in 5 minutes." As the ship's engines roared to life and the vibration of the takeoff rattled the hull, I sat on the floor of the cargo bay, holding Kalia. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, but she was alive. I looked out the small porthole as Rusthold began to shrink into a speck of light against the blackness of the void. We had lost the workshop. We had lost the gutter. We had lost Mordak. But as I looked at the gray girl in my arms, I realized that Silas was wrong. They aren't just built. They aren't just subroutines. And the Union was wrong too. You can't mass-produce a soul, and you can't delete one once it's been awakened. I reached into my pack and pulled out Lyra's shawl. I draped it over Kalia, the deep blue silk shimmering in the ship's emergency lights. "We're not scrap anymore, Kalia," I whispered. "We're a shared breath, and the universe is a lot bigger than a scrap heap." As we slipped into the silence of the long-haul jump, I knew the turning point wasn't the fight in the tunnels. It was the moment Mordak remembered his song. It was the moment Kalia chose to heal the monster that was trying to kill her. It was the moment we realized that being a person isn't about how you were made. It's about who you choose to save. Nexara was not the paradise the star charts promised. It was a jagged, atmospheric rock clinging to the edge of a dying sun, a place where the air was thick with the scent of red dust and the sulfurous burps of 1,000 mining vents. When the ramp of the Star Seeker lowered, I didn't see the lush biodomes of the independent colonies. I saw a frontier town built out of scavenged freighter hulls and reinforced plascrete, a place that looked like it had been punched into the side of a mountain and decided to stay there out of spite. Captain Eris, the mahogany-skinned woman who had pulled us out of the fire, looked at me as she holstered her sidearm. "Watch your step, Stitcher. Nexara is free, but free usually means nobody is coming to help when the dust storms hit. And keep the girl's hood up. We have enough trouble without a Union beacon walking through the main square." Kalia was still weak. She leaned against me, her slate-gray hand clutching my work jacket. The deep blue shawl I had draped over her was covered in a layer of fine, copper-colored grit. I could feel the hum of her empathy core beneath her ribs, a low, frantic thrumming that told me she was awake and absorbing the world around her. "It's loud here, Vane," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the roar of the colony's ventilation turbines. "It isn't the scream of Rusthold. It's a low growl, like a pack of hounds waiting for the gate to open." "That's just the frontier," I said, though my gut was telling me she was right. People here are survivalists. They don't have time for manners. We made our way through the docking bay, past groups of miners with cybernetic limbs and traders with faces scarred by radiation. Nexara was a refuge for the unwanted, but it was a cold kind of sanctuary. There were no smiles here, only the hard, calculating stares of people who measured everything by its weight in credits or its caloric value. Captain Eris led us to a central hub that served as the colony's administration center. Inside, the air was slightly cleaner, filtered by ancient scrubbers that rattled in the ceiling. Standing at the center of a circular table was a man in an faded military uniform, his eyes gray and hard as flint. This was Commander Harlan, the man who decided who lived and who died on Nexara. "Eris," Harlan said, his voice a rasping growl. "I expected you back 2 days ago, and I didn't expect you to bring company." "They're under my protection, Harlan," Eris replied, her jaw set. "This is Vane, a Stitcher from the Outer Rings. And the girl is special. Harlan walked around the table, his heavy boots clicking on the metal floor. He stopped in front of Kalia and reached out a hand to pull back her hood. I stepped forward, my hand moving toward the pry bar in my belt, but Eris caught my arm. "Let him see," she muttered. Harlan pulled back the blue silk. Kalia blinked, her amber eyes wide and luminous in the harsh fluorescent light. Her dual pupils spun for a second before focusing on the commander. Harlan didn't flinch, but I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. "A Voreen," Harlan whispered. "A 7 series. Do you have any idea what you brought to my doorstep, Eris?" The Union broadcasted a high-priority alert 16 hours ago. They're offering a bounty of 50,000 marks and a 10-year exemption from trade tariffs for the return of Subject 749. "She has a name," I spat, "and she's not a subject." Harlan looked at me, his gaze cold and unimpressed. "You're the Stitcher, the one who thinks he's playing hero in a galaxy that doesn't have any. Listen to me, Vane. Nexara survives because we are invisible. We are a speck of dust in the void. But you're a signal flare. If the Union tracks her here, they won't just take her. They'll glass this entire colony to make sure the tech doesn't fall into the hands of the Independents." "He's afraid," Kalia said suddenly. Her voice was clear, cutting through the tension of the room. "He isn't angry. He's terrified. He sees 1,000 dead people when he looks at me." Harlan froze. His gray eyes narrowed, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine shock on his face. "How did you—" "She's an empathy unit," I said, crossing my arms. "She feels what you feel. And right now she's feeling the cowardice you're trying to hide behind that uniform." Harlan's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Enough! I'm not harboring a Union weapon on this rock. Eris, take them back to the ship. They leave on the next tide cycle." "Commander," Eris said, her voice rising, "if we turn them away, they're dead. Mordak didn't make it, but the Union will send others. They'll hunt them until there's nothing left but scrap." "That is not my problem," Harlan barked. "My problem is the 5,000 souls living in these domes. I will not sacrifice them for a biosynth and a delusional old man." I looked at Kalia. She was staring at Harlan, her eyes reflecting the cold, clinical light of the room. But she wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She looked disappointed. It was the look of someone who had hoped for a bridge and found only another wall. We walked out of the administration center, the red dust of Nexara swirling around our boots. Eris was silent, her head bowed. I felt the weight of the universe pressing down on me again. We had run across half the sector only to find that the free world was just a different kind of prison. "Vane?" Kalia asked as we reached the docking ramp of the Starseeker. "Yeah, kid. Is everyone in the galaxy afraid of things they don't understand?" I looked at the jagged peaks of the mountains, the red sun setting in a haze of industrial smog. "Most of them," I said. "Fear is easy, Kalia. It's the default setting for most people. It takes work to be anything else." But the Tuesday was not done with us yet. A sudden, sharp alarm began to blare from the colony's loudspeakers, a high-pitched, rhythmic wail that meant only one thing: decompression or invasion. I looked up at the sky. A hole was opening in the clouds, but it wasn't a weather phenomenon. It was the shimmering blue-white light of a localized warp jump. A Union frigate, sleek and predatory, was descending through the atmosphere, its landing thrusters scorching the red earth. They didn't wait for Harlan to make a choice. The Union had found us, and they were here to collect their debt. Commander Harlan came running out of the hub, his face pale. "They're here! They've bypassed our orbital sensors." I looked at Kalia. The gold light in her eyes was blazing now, a fierce, unyielding glow. She wasn't trembling anymore. She looked at the descending ship and then at the terrified colonists running for cover. "They are not here for the colony, Vane," she said, her voice echoing with a strange harmonic resonance. "They are here for the resonance, and they will kill everyone to stop the music." I grabbed the pry bar and my welding torch. "Then we'd better make sure the music is loud enough to hear in the next system." The Union frigate touched down with a bone-jarring thud 300 meters from the main dome. The air around the landing site turned into a swirling vortex of red dust and superheated steam. From the bowels of the ship, a squad of enforcers emerged, their white armor gleaming like teeth. But they weren't the real threat. Behind them walked a trio of Voidwalkers, biological mirrors of Mordak, their faces blank masks of pale flesh and clicking sensors. Commander Harlan stood at the colony gates, his small defense force clutching their outdated pulse rifles with shaking hands. He looked at the approaching Union force and then back at Kalia, who was standing beside me on the docking ramp. "Give her to them," someone in the crowd of colonists screamed. "Hand her over and they'll leave us alone." The cry was picked up by dozens of voices. The mob was forming, fueled by the raw, animal panic that Kalia had sensed earlier. They were pushing toward the ramp, their faces twisted with a mix of fear and hatred. They didn't see a girl. They saw a death sentence. Harlan turned to me, his hand on his sidearm. "Vane, listen to them. Look at those ships. You can't win this. If you give her up now, I can negotiate for the colony's safety." "Negotiate?" I spat, stepping down from the ramp. "You think they're here to talk, Harlan? They're here to erase the evidence. As soon as they have her, they'll flatline this entire rock to make sure nobody else knows what she is. You're not saving your people. You're just making it easier for the Union to kill them." "He's lying," a miner yelled, throwing a piece of ore that clattered against the Starseeker's hull. "He's just a scrap thief protecting his prize." Kalia stepped forward, her blue shawl whipping in the wind. She looked at the mob, at the terrified faces of the men and women who wanted to sacrifice her to save themselves. I could feel the empathy core surging, the golden light radiating from her skin in visible waves. "I can feel you," she cried, her voice amplified by the core until it vibrated in the very air. "I can feel the poison in your hearts. You think that by giving me back to the dark, you will find the light? You are wrong. The dark is already inside you." The mob faltered, the sheer intensity of her voice pushing them back. But the Union enforcers were closer now, their boots thudding in a rhythmic, terrifying beat. The lead Voidwalker raised a hand, and a heavy-caliber pulse cannon began to whine as it charged. "Commander Harlan," Kalia said, turning to the man in the faded uniform, "you have a choice. You can be the man who follows the mandate of fear, or you can be the man who stands for the dandelion." Harlan blinked, the strange word clearly catching him off guard. "The dandelion? It is something Lyra said," I muttered, standing beside her. "It means seeing the life in things that the world calls scrap. It means being a person, Harlan, not a subroutine." The Voidwalker fired. The blue energy bolt slammed into the ground 20 meters in front of us, sending a spray of molten rock into the air. The impact threw several colonists to the ground, and the screams turned from anger to pure, unadulterated terror. Commander Harlan looked at the Union squad, then at the mob of his own people, and finally at the gray girl who was looking at him with eyes that saw everything he was and everything he could be. Something changed in his face. The hard, flinty mask of the pragmatist cracked, revealing a man who had spent too many years hiding in the shadows of the void. He pulled his sidearm, but he didn't point it at Kalia. He pointed it at the approaching enforcers. "Defense units!" Harlan roared, his voice regaining the authority of a true commander. "Form a perimeter. We are Nexara. We do not trade our souls for a ceasefire." The colonists froze. The miners and traders looked at their leader, then at each other. The mob mentality is a fragile thing. It can turn from cowardice to courage in the space of a single breath if the right spark is lit. Arias was the first to move. She jumped from the cockpit of her ship, a heavy-duty thermal repeater in her hands. "For the dandelion!" she yelled, a fierce, wild grin on her face. The defense force began to fire. The air turned into a chaotic storm of blue and red energy bolts. I pulled Kalia back toward the ship's cargo bay, my mind racing. This wasn't just a skirmish, it was an execution. We were outnumbered and outgunned, and the Union wouldn't stop until every heart on Nexara had ceased its resonance. "Vane," Kalia said, grabbing my arm. She was pale, her light flickering. "I can stop them." "No, Kalia, you're not a weapon. We're getting you out of here." "I am not talking about killing them," she said, her amber eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. "I am talking about making them feel. All of them. The enforcers, the Voidwalkers, the Union. If I open the core entirely, if I let the resonance of Nexara flow through me and out into the void, they will have to feel the weight of what they are doing." "Kalia, That will kill you, I said, my voice cracking. Your body wasn't built to handle that kind of load. You'll burn out your nervous system in seconds. She looked at me, and for a moment I didn't see a biosynth. I didn't see a runaway. I saw Lyra. I saw the woman who had died to save a sector that didn't even know her name. It is my choice, Vane, she whispered. You taught me that family is a choice. You chose to be my father. You chose to be my hull. Now I am choosing to be the soul of this colony. I felt a tear track through the red dust on my cheek. I've spent 3 years trying to save things that were already gone, Kalia. I don't want to lose you too. You won't lose me, she said, touching my face. We are a shared breath. Remember? She stepped out into the center of the docking bay, away from the cover of the ship. The battle was raging all around her, but as she raised her hands, the chaos seemed to slow. The golden light erupting from her core was no longer a flicker. It was a sun, a brilliant, blinding radiance that filled the entire dome, turning the red dust into a shimmering haze of gold. I saw the enforcers stop. I saw the Voidwalkers drop their weapons, their mechanical sensors spinning in a frantic, overloaded frenzy. And then I felt it. It wasn't a physical wave. It was an emotional tsunami. I felt the hope of the miners. I felt the regret of Commander Harlan. I felt the fierce loyalty of Captain Eris. But most of all, I felt the love of a girl who had found a home in the heart of a broken old man. The resonance spread outward, beyond the dome, into the Union frigate, into the cold, empty hearts of the men who had sent the hunters. For a few seconds, the entire colony was bound together by a single, undeniable truth, that we were alive and that our lives mattered. The Union ship's thrusters sputtered. The enforcers collapsed to their knees, some of them weeping, their corporate conditioning shattered by the sudden, overwhelming influx of human emotion. The Voidwalkers simply went dark, their processors unable to handle the frequency of a soul. Then the light faded. Kalia collapsed. I ran to her, catching her before she hit the deck. Her skin was cold, her amber eyes dim. The golden glow in her core was a tiny, guttering spark. Kalia! I roared, pulling her against my chest. Stay with me. Don't you dare go into the void. She looked up at me, a tiny, fragile smile on her mandibles. The music, it was beautiful, wasn't it, Vane? Yes, I choked out. It was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. The Union frigate began to retreat, its engines firing in a disorganized, frantic manner. They were running. The hunters had become the hunted, chased away not by plasma bolts, but by the sheer, unadulterated weight of their own crimes. Commander Harlan walked over to us, his uniform torn, his face covered in soot. He looked at Kalia, and then at the sky where the Union ship was disappearing into the clouds. She saved us, Harlan whispered. I looked at him, my heart breaking and mending at the same time. No, Harlan, she chose us, and now we have to choose her. I picked her up in my arms, this tall, gray girl who was the only daughter I would ever have. The battle was over, but the transformation was only beginning. Nexara was no longer a collection of shacks and fear. It was a home, and as I carried Kalia back into the dome, I knew that the hull stitcher's job was finally done. The wounds were sealed, the soul was intact. And the shared breath was still warm. The silence that followed the golden resonance flare was more terrifying than the roar of the Union frigate. It was a vacuum of sound, a sudden, heavy absence that felt as though the entire colony of Nexara had collectively held its breath and forgotten how to let it go. The golden haze that had turned the red dust into a shimmering sea of light began to dissipate, leaving behind a world that looked older, more tired, and fundamentally changed. I was on my knees in the center of the docking bay, my arms wrapped around Kalia's limp gray form. Her skin was no longer slate gray. It had faded to a sickly, translucent ash, and the warmth I had felt from her core just moments ago had vanished. I pressed my ear to her chest, ignored the copper tang of blood in my mouth, and listened. There was a heartbeat, but it was irregular, a series of frantic, wet thumps that sounded like a bird trapped in a tin box. Kalia, I whispered, my voice cracked and raw. Kalia, you stubborn girl, look at me. She didn't move. Her dual pupils were fixed and dilated. The golden light that usually swirled within them reduced to a few pathetic, dying sparks. Behind me, the sound of the world began to return. I heard the frantic shouts of the miners, the hiss of cooling thrusters, and the low, agonizing moans of the Union enforcers who were still scattered across the deck like discarded dolls. Commander Harlan approached, his heavy boots clanking slowly on the metal. He looked down at us, his face a mask of disbelief and something that looked uncomfortably like reverence. He was still clutching his sidearm, but his hand was shaking so violently that the barrel was rattling against his thigh. "They're leaving, Vane," Harlan said, his voice a ghost of its former growl. "The frigate. It's breaking atmosphere. They're running like they've seen the face of a god and realized they were on the wrong side of the war." I didn't care about the frigate. I didn't care about the war. I looked at the commander, my eyes burning with a sudden, fierce desperation. "Harlan, I need a biomed suite, now." Her core is overheating. It's tearing her nervous system apart from the inside. Harlan didn't hesitate. He gestured to two of his soldiers who had survived the blast. "Get a stretcher. Take them to the central hub. Tell the medics that if this girl doesn't make it, they'll be walking the vacuum without suits." We moved in a blur of motion. I refused to let go of her hand, even as they lifted her onto the grav stretcher. We raced through the colony's red-dusted streets, past people who were standing in their doorways, watching us with wide, silent eyes. These were the same people who had wanted to hand her over just an hour ago. Now, they were stepping aside, some of them even bowing their heads as we passed. They had felt her. They had felt the weight of her choice, and it had shattered their fear. The medbay was a cramped, sterile room filled with the smell of ozone and old chemicals. Eris was already there, clearing a table and barking orders at a terrified young medic who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Get the neural inhibitors," Eris roared, "and find a way to stabilize her bioelectric frequency. She's redlining." I stood in the corner, clutching the blue silk shawl that had fallen from Kalia's shoulders. My hands were stained with red dust and her gray biofluids. I felt 105 years old. I felt like the hull stitcher who had finally found a breach he couldn't seal. "Vane," Eris said, walking over to me and placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "You need to sit down. You're bleeding from the head, and your arm looks like it's been through a plasma grinder." "I'm fine," I muttered, though the room was starting to tilt. "Fix her, Eris. Use the dandelion." Eris frowned. "The what?" "The resonance," I said, reaching into my pack and pulling out Lyra's data pendant. The crystal was glowing with a steady, warm amber light. It held the frequency of a woman who had seen the life in everything. It was the only thing I had left that wasn't broken. If Kalia's core is a weapon that's turned on itself, maybe we can use this to ground her, to give her something to focus on that isn't the pain of the world. Eris took the pendant, her intelligent eyes scanning the flickering data stream. "It's a memory loop," she whispered, "a high-fidelity emotional imprint. If I can patch this into her sensory input array, it might act as a buffer. It might tell her nervous system that it's okay to stop fighting." "Do it," I said. The next few hours were a descent into a specific kind of hell. I watched through a plexiglass window as Eris and the medic worked. They had to open Kalia's chest plating, revealing the intricate, glowing machinery of the empathy core. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing, a mass of organic fibers and crystalline processors that pulsed with a faint, erratic light. It looked like a heart made of starlight and circuitry. As Eris soldered the connection between the data pendant and the core, a sudden, sharp projection filled the medbay. It was Lyra. The holographic image was clearer than it had ever been, her laughter echoing through the sterile room. She was holding that dandelion, her eyes bright with wonder. "It is a citizen, not a fuel source," the hologram said, her voice a warm, melodic chime. Kalia's body arched on the table. A series of high-pitched melodic tones erupted from her processors, matching the frequency of Lyra's laughter. The jagged, golden light in her eyes softened, the frantic spinning of her pupils slowing until they found a rhythmic, steady pulse. The monitors, which had been screaming in a series of jagged red lines, began to level out. The blue-green waves of her biological signature returned to a calm, predictable swell. "She's stabilizing," the medic whispered, wiping sweat from his brow. "The feedback loop is closing. She's She's resting. I slumped against the wall, the strength finally leaving my legs. I slid down the metal plating until I was sitting on the cold floor, the blue shawl clutched to my chest. I felt a sob catch in my throat, a deep, agonizing release that I had been holding back since I first found Kalia against my workshop wall. Commander Harlan walked into the room, his heavy coat covered in the red grime of the battlefield. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at the girl on the table and then at the hologram of Lyra that was still slowly fading in the air. "She really did it," Harlan said, his voice devoid of its usual cynicism. "She changed the frequency of the entire colony. Even my soldiers. They're out there now, sharing their rations with the enforcers we captured. They aren't looking at them as Union scum anymore. They're looking at them as men who are just as broken as we are." "That's what she does," I said, looking up at him. "She doesn't just feel the pain, Harlan. She makes you realize that you don't have to be the cause of it." Harlan nodded slowly. "I spent 20 years thinking that the only way to survive was to build walls, to keep the void out. But she showed us that the void is already inside us, and the only way to survive it is to light a fire." He paused, his gray eyes softening. "Nexara is going to be different from now on, Vane. We're not going to be a specks of dust hiding in a mountain. We're going to be a beacon. We're going to offer sanctuary to every Voreen, every runaway, every person the corporations have tried to turn into scrap." "And the Union?" I asked. "They'll be back." "Let them come," Harlan said, and this time there was no fear in his voice. "We'll be ready, not with just guns and shields, but with the knowledge that we're fighting for something that can't be flatlined." He turned to leave, but then he stopped and looked at me. "You're a good stitcher, Vane. You sealed the biggest breach of all." I didn't answer. I just watched Kalia's chest rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. I had spent 32 years welding metal, thinking that a solid seam was the only thing that mattered. But as I sat there in the quiet med bay, I realized that the strongest welds aren't made of plasma and alloy. They're made of the moments when we choose to stay, when we choose to care, when we choose to be a family in a universe that tells us we should be alone. The dandelion wasn't just a flower, and Kalia wasn't just a machine. They were proof that life, in all its messy, beautiful, and defective glory, will always find a way to grow through the cracks in the iron. 6 months had passed since the red dust of Nexara had been turned to gold. The colony was no longer the jagged, desperate outpost I had first encountered. It had grown. New domes had been grafted onto the mountainside, their transparent skins shimmering under the pale sun. But more than the architecture, the spirit of the place had transformed. You could hear it in the laughter of the children in the hydroponics bays, and you could see it in the way the miners and the Voreens worked side by side, their movements synchronized not by corporate mandates, but by a genuine, hard-earned respect. I had a new workshop now. It wasn't a cramped, greasy hole in a scrap heap. It was a wide, airy space with large windows that looked out over the jagged peaks of the Nexara range. The smell of ozone was still there, but it was tempered by the scent of real earth and the blooming jasmine plants that Kalia insisted on keeping near the ventilation intakes. I was at my new welding bench, working on the stabilization fins for a colony transport. My hands were still scarred, and my back still popped like a series of small explosions every time I stood up. But the weight in my chest was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. Vane. I didn't need to turn around to know it was her. Kalia had developed a way of moving that was no longer a ghost-like glide. She walked with a solid, confident rhythm, her heavy boots clunking on the floor plates with the pride of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. She was taller than ever, her gray skin healthy and glowing with a faint, iridescent sheen. The empathy core in her chest had been repaired, but it was different now. Eris had helped us integrate Lyra's data pendant into the circuitry permanently. Kalia was no longer just a mirror for the pain of others. She was a reservoir of the love that had been left behind. She could still feel the world, but she had a buffer, a resonance of joy that allowed her to filter the static. "The shipment of thermal shielding has arrived from the lower mines," Kalia said, stepping up to the bench. "I have already sorted them by density and heat tolerance." "Good girl," I said, wiping my hands on a grease-stained rag. "You're becoming a better foreman than I ever was." Kalia smiled, her mandibles clicking in a way that I had grown to find incredibly endearing. I have had a good teacher. But Commander Harlan is asking for you at the administration hub. He says the new arrivals from Sector 7 are having trouble adjusting to the atmosphere. I'll be there in a minute, I said, setting down my torch. Just let me finish this seam. I watched her for a moment as she began to organize the tools on the far wall. She picked up the old wooden broom, the one with the flowers Lyra had carved, and began to sweep the floor. She handled that piece of timber with more care than most people handled their children. It was a link to a past she had never known and a future she was helping to build. Transformation is a strange thing. Most people think it happens all at once, in a flash of light or a moment of crisis. But I've learned that real change is a slow, methodical process. It's the act of showing up day after day and choosing to be better than you were the day before. It's the way a piece of raw alloy becomes a structural rib through the constant application of heat and pressure. I had started this journey as a man who was waiting to die, a ghost in a tomb of his own making. I had looked at the universe and seen only a scrap heap, but Kalia had changed the frequency of my soul. She had taught me that being a father isn't about blood or biology. It's about being the one who holds the torch when the darkness gets too thick. It's about choosing to be the hull that protects the spark. I walked over to the window and looked out at the colony. I saw Commander Harlan talking to a group of newly arrived Voreens, his hands open and welcoming. I saw Eris prepping her ship for another run to the outer rings, her crew laughing as they loaded the cargo. I saw a world that was trying, in its own clumsy, imperfect way, to be kind. My mind drifted back to the journey. I thought about the cold tunnels of Rusthold, the silent scream of the gutter, and the moment Mordak had remembered his song. I thought about the first bowl of protein mash and the way Kalia had looked at me like I had handed her the stars. I realized then that the Union could send 100 fleets and they would never truly win, because they were fighting for assets and we were fighting for each other. They were building walls and we were building bridges, and a bridge, no matter how fragile, will always outlast a wall because it has somewhere to go. I sat down in the quiet of my workshop, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and for the first time in 3 years, I let myself truly remember Lyra without the grief crushing the air out of my lungs. I saw her face, her bright eyes, and I heard her voice telling me to look at the dandelion. I spent so many years thinking that when she died, my life had become a closed circuit. I thought the only thing left to do was to wait for the power to fail. I didn't realize that a heart is like a star. It only shines because it's burning itself up for the sake of something else. I had shrunk my world down to the size of a welding bench because I was afraid of the weight of the air. But then she came along, that gray, starving girl with the spinning gold eyes. She didn't just ask for a meal, she asked for a reason to exist. And in giving her one, I found my own. I've learned that we aren't defined by the parts we were born with or the serial numbers etched into our skin. We are defined by the transactions we make with the people around us. The way we choose to spend our time, our energy, and our love. You can't mass produce a soul, and you can't automate kindness. Those things are handcrafted, one small act at a time. I look at Kalia now, and I don't see a miracle of bioengineering. I see a daughter, I see a future, I see the reason why I'm still breathing. And I wonder, in a universe this big and this cold, how many other dandelions are waiting in the scrap heaps for someone to tell them they are citizens? I stood up and walked over to Kalia. She looked up from her sweeping, her amber eyes bright and full of a quiet, steady peace. "Ready to go?" she asked. "Ready," I said. I reached out and took the broom from her, placing it carefully in its rack. Then I put my arm around her shoulders, a hull stitcher and a Voreen, a father and a daughter. We walked out of the workshop together, leaving the tools behind and stepping into the warm, red sunlight of Nexara. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the low hum of a colony that was finally, truly alive. We weren't scrap. We weren't property. We were a shared breath, and the song was just beginning. I looked at the horizon, where the red sun was touching the tops of the mountains, and I thought about the people listening to this tale in their own quiet corners of the void. I spent most of my life believing that I was just a man who fixed broken things. I thought that once a heart was shattered, the pieces were only good for the recycler. But here I am, standing on a rock at the edge of the galaxy, with a family I had to travel across the stars to find. So I have to ask you, sitting there in the quiet of your own life, is there someone you've been walking past, thinking they were just part of the background? Is there a broken piece of your own world that you've given up on? What would happen if you chose to stay, to look closer, and to offer a shared breath to a stranger who has forgotten how to breathe? I took a deep breath of the filtered Nexara air and smiled. Beside me, Kalia adjusted her blue silk shawl, the fabric catching the evening light like a falling star. We turned toward the administration hub, two people walking toward a future that we had stitched together with our own hands. The resonance was perfect.